Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the Presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Millard Fillmore, and the focus is debating the Compromise of 1850. The year is 1849. Zachary Taylor is the new president, Millard Fillmore, the new vice president of the United States, and the country is locked in a pretty bitter debate about an old topic, nothing new, slavery, but particularly focused on the potential for the expansion of slavery into the vast new territories that had recently been brought into the United States as a result of the war with Mexico. You've got the new state of Texas and these vast territories out west, California, New Mexico. Big question, would slavery be permitted to expand into these new territories? During the war, a lot of this in Congress was brought to a head by a congressman by the name of David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, who introduced an amendment to an appropriation bill that would ban slavery in those territories. In Wilmot's amendment, that as an express and fundamental condition to the acquisition of any territory from the Republic of Mexico by the United States, by virtue of any treaty which may be negotiated between them, and to the use by the executive of the monies herein appropriated. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of said territory, except for crime whereof the party shall first be duly convicted. Now, this so-called Wilmot Proviso was introduced. It failed to pass, but it was reintroduced several times by the North. This topic was not going away, and when Congress came back into session in December of 1849, this was the big topic of discussion. Opening up that debate was the President of the United States, Zachary Taylor. He introduced what he called the President's Plan, and the premise of this was to try to get this to be as least controversial as possible. And Taylor's idea was to bring California and New Mexico, very large territories out west, into the United States, not as territories, but as states. By bringing them in as states, they would decide their own fate about the legality of slavery, as opposed to Congress, which had authority over territories. Now, in the past, usually new lands would come in as territories, and Congress would oversee the governance for some period of time before they would become states. Taylor tried to circumvent that. He thought if he could bring them in as states right away, you keep those politicians in Washington out of this discussion, leave it up to the locals, and besides, this would also help him solve a border dispute between New Mexico and Texas over some of those lands. If they came in as states, then an argument between states would go to the Supreme Court, again, not to Congress, and this was preferred by Taylor because he thought if Congress tried to solve all these problems, it was just going to be a big partisan political mess. Well, Congress was not aligned with this way of thinking, not at all. They felt this was their job. This is what they were elected by the American people to do, to legislate over national issues such as this. And they were ready to put forward proposals on how to deal with these issues, but not just about expanding slavery into these territories, perhaps even bigger issues that Taylor didn't want on the table at all. We turn to Henry Clay. Now, Henry Clay had been involved in some grand compromises in the past. He was an aging senator from Kentucky, but he had been involved in the 1820 Missouri Compromise. He had been involved heavily in the 1833 Compromise over the nullification crisis, and he wanted to have one more grand compromise on his way out the door. So on January 29, 1850, he offered an outline for one more big compromise. He told the Senate, "I hold in my hand a series of resolutions which I desire to submit to the consideration of this body that will produce an amiable arrangement of all questions and controversy between the free and slave states growing out of the subject of slavery." His grand compromise had 8 parts. Number 1, California would come in as a free state. Number 2, New Mexico and Utah would come in as territories, and Congress would make determinations about slavery in those territories. Number 3, New Mexico would win most of the border dispute with Texas. Number 4, Texas would get compensation of $10 million in return. Number 5, Washington, D.C., slavery would continue to still be legal in the nation's capital. But number 6, the slave trade would be outlawed in the nation's capital. Number 7, Congress would enact a more effective and stringent fugitive slave law. And number 8, Congress would confirm that it had no power to interfere with the slave trade in the slave-holding states. All issues, one big bucket. That was Henry Clay's perspective. Zachary Taylor, again, was completely against this, sitting in his presidential chair. He thought it was asking for trouble, taking on issues that were not necessary at this time. Washington, D.C. having a firestorm of debate. Much of that debate would take place in the United States Senate, with Millard Fillmore presiding over those arguments. This would be a swan song for many illustrious senators, people who have been around a long time and been prominent on many issues, like Henry Clay and John Calhoun, Daniel Webster, and Thomas Benton toward the end of their careers. But you also had newcomers. You had like Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, William Seward, former governor of New York, now senator from New York. He would certainly weigh in on this topic. This was a critical moment for the United States on the path to national fracture. The divide was very real. Talk of secession was real here in the Senate during the course of the session of 1849 to 1850. Now, these debates represented passion on both sides. John Calhoun had been the leader of the states' rights perspective in the South really his entire life, his entire career, and he was consistent to the end. In his offering, we, as the representatives of the states of this union, should come to a distinct understanding in order to ascertain whether the great question can be settled. If the North will not settle them on the broad principle of justice and duty, say so, and let the states separate. If you are unwilling, we should part in peace. Tell us so, and we shall know what to do. California will become the test question if you admit her. You compel us to infer that you intend to exclude us from the whole of the territories with the intention of destroying irretrievably the equilibrium. The words of John Calhoun, he didn't speak these words. He was too ill. He had James Mason read it for him, and in fact, within a few days, John Calhoun would be dead. Daniel Webster responded, countered with equal passion and powers of persuasion from the North perspective. According to Webster, secession, peaceable secession, who was so foolish as to expect any such thing? Where is the line to be drawn? What states are to secede? What is to remain American? What am I to be, an American no longer? I would rather hear of war, pestilence, and famine than hear gentlemen talk of secession. I see it as plainly as I see the sun in heaven that disruption must produce war. Such a war as I will not describe, the words of Daniel Webster. Now, William Seward had a different perspective on this, really kind of a game changer from a perspective in that it wasn't about the Constitution anymore. He introduced a new topic. According to Seward, there is a higher law than the Constitution, a higher law than the Constitution, which regulates our authority over the domain and devotes it to the same noble purposes. Let your broad domain descend to us unencumbered and free from calamities of human bondage. I am opposed to compromise in any and all the forms proposed. A higher law than the Constitution. Now, this was still a relatively new concept and frankly was anathema to strict constructionists of the Constitution like Millard Fillmore. They thought this was a radical perspective. The Constitution was their anchor for making these kinds of decisions. But Seward was saying no. In the case of slavery expansion, there is indeed a higher law. This was still a novel concept, but it would certainly grow in prominence over time. Now, there were not just words in this debate. There was actually nearly violence on the floor of the Senate. Take, for example, April 17th of 1850, after a bitter exchange between Senator Benton and Mississippi's Henry Foote, Foote pulled out a loaded pistol. Chaos ensued on the floor of the Senate, and Millard Fillmore in the presiding chair immediately called for an adjournment. Calm those passions, and fortunately no shots were fired, but this shows the intensity of these debates. Now, through it all, Fillmore actually got some pretty high marks in overseeing these very contentious debates. One gentleman, Alexander Stephens, congressman from Georgia, who would be the future vice president of the Confederacy, had high praise for Fillmore's role. The crowning halo was imparted by Millard Fillmore, who presided over the whole as vice president of the United States. He was of most imperturbable temper and of a personal appearance in every way impressive. Order and decorum, with all the proprieties which should govern high debate, were stamped on his brow. He did get general praise for his role in at least overseeing these highly contentious debates. Now, this was all in the United States Senate, but what about the executive branch? Potential veto coming from President Taylor, because he was not aligned with much of this at all. Again, he thought it was taking on all manner of topics that were too contentious. Let these guys come into state, solve the problem themselves, and live to fight perhaps another day. Possible veto was coming out of the White House. Millard Fillmore well, he could potentially have a role. If the vote is tied in the Senate, he would have to cast a tie-breaking vote. And he had decided that he would favor the compromise measures if they all passed, and he went about telling his president, Zachary Taylor, that very fact. He told Taylor, if I should feel it my duty to vote for it, which he did, that it was not out of any hostility to him or his administration, but the vote would be given because I deemed it for the interests of the country. Well, Millard Fillmore would have a lot more say on this topic than even he imagined at this point, because the president, Zachary Taylor, was about to get sick. And that's the story for another day. That is Millard Fillmore and Debating the Compromise of 1850 from the life of Millard Fillmore. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.